This is a presentation on Helen Bradford Thompson Woolley by Robert Friedel. Helen Woolley was a pioneering researcher, notably for her work on the sex differences in mental traits, and also her research on child development. She was also an activist and involved in the women's suffrage movement, and just a trailblazer for being a woman in a largely male-dominated field. She was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1874 to Paul Thompson and Isabel Perkins Faxon. She had two siblings, Jane and Lillian. Lillian would go on to become a school teacher. Her father, Paul, was an inventor, which perhaps inspired her pursuit of the sciences, and her mother was a missionary. And although she didn't share her mother's faith, it may have been influential for her to see a woman in a leadership role in early life. After graduating valedictorian at her high school, she received a scholarship to attend the University of Chicago. She went with the original intention of becoming a teacher before discovering empirical psychology and neurology. There she also met her future husband, Paul Woolley. They would be engaged for 8 years while he attended Johns Hopkins, and she went on to pursue a PhD still at the University of Chicago under the supervision of James Engel. And it was then when she published her groundbreaking work, The Psychological Norms of Men and Women. So, Psychological Norms of Men and Women was actually her PhD dissertation. It was later renamed The Mental Traits of Men and Women when she wrote the book, and is really known for being the first major scientific experimentation comparing the cognitive abilities of men and women. She tested across a range of abilities, and by and large found no significant differences. In the slight differences she did find, she theorized were more due to upbringing and societal influences rather than being innate. And this really challenged the prevailing thought at the time that men and women were intellectually varied. And as such, it received high acclaim and widespread criticism and pushback. After graduating, she spent 4 years teaching at Mount Holyoke College for Women, South Hadley, Massachusetts. Then she moved to Japan, where she met Paul, and they got married in Yokohama. And then after that, they moved to the Philippines, where she worked for the Bureau of Education. And then they moved to Siam shortly after that, which is now Thailand, and that's where she published Sensory Affection and Emotion. And then after becoming pregnant, she moved back to the United States upon Paul's insistence, where she had her first daughter, which really interested her in child psychology. So during her time in the Philippines, she was asked to determine the best ages to establish compulsory schooling for Filipino children. So she spent months tracking down records from local cathedrals because birth records were not well kept in the Philippines at the time. And upon conducting her research, she found and recommended that ages 9 to 12 were the most optimal years for compulsory schooling. In 1907, she published The Sensory Affection of Emotion, which reviewed Carl Stump's discussions on the affective process. And in 1910, she published The Development of Right-Handedness in a Normal Infant, which was one of her early works on child development. And a lot of her research and influence came from spending time with her daughter Eleanor. So soon after, she and the family moved to Cincinnati, where she lectured at the University of Cincinnati, and in 1911 became the director of the Cincinnati Vocation Bureau. Through them, she started investigating environmental conditions and development of school children. For a lot of this research, she teamed up with Charlotte Fisher, and in the meantime also resumed her work on sex differences. It was also here she became very involved in the women's suffrage movement. often being a spokeswoman as the voice of science in the movement. Her and Paul had their second child, Margaret, in Cincinnati, and then she was abruptly forced to move because of Paul's career change. So part of her work under the Cincinnati Vocation Bureau investigated children who were falling behind without being classified as mentally defective, for whom she set up a special class where they received individual attention, and found that substantially aided progress, and also that heredity did not seem to influence performance as much as was popularly believed at the time. And then when she teamed up with Charlotte Fisher, they took over a study that was comparing the mental and physical development of working children and school children. And they found that school children performed better in most physical development categories and all categories of mental development, suggesting school was better in almost every way for children, which had a significant impact on child labor laws at the time and a lasting impact. So while she was working on child development, she simultaneously rekindled her work on sex and gender. She published several articles reviewing the literature on sex and gender, which she largely critiqued as being unscientific and full of personal bias and impaired logic. So after moving from Cincinnati, they moved to Detroit, and she became the assistant director of the Merrill Palmer School, where she developed one of the first experimental nursery schools in the U.S. Her husband, Paul, contracted tuberculosis and eventually divorced her, and then died in 1932. And so in order to stay on top of finances, she took a second job at Teachers College at Columbia University in New York, where she was promised a lifetime salary and repositioning if the institution should lose funding. So following her divorce and the death of a friend, she took a year leave of absence where she recovered at a sanitarium in New York. And after returning to work and teaching again at Teachers College, Dean William Russell unexpectedly asked for a resignation. This was despite the agreement she had with Russell's father for a lifelong salary. And is also despite the renown she gained for the institution just because of her international acclaim and her groundbreaking contributions. So after being fired from Teachers College, she spent 10 years searching for a job, to no avail. It was the onset of the Great Depression, and it was very difficult for women at the time to find jobs in higher education. So she moved in with her daughter Eleanor and Eleanor's husband Cedric. Her mental health began to decline, and she was experiencing increasing paranoia that Teachers College and Russell were undermining her efforts to find further employment. They eventually all of them moved to Westgate, Pennsylvania, and that's where she died of a cerebral hemorrhage on Christmas Eve of 1947. She was 72 years old. So Helen Woolley left a prominent legacy. At age 55, she was considered one of America's top child psychologists. She wrote 3 books, around 50 articles, and created novel child development and nursery programs. Her research on sex and gender was groundbreaking, is empirically based and challenged predominant myths, and research like that is still conducted today in much more prominent. And her work on child development influenced child labor laws. She had significant social impact, and that includes her work as a suffragist. And she's just among a pioneering generation of college-educated women, and even more rarely earned a PhD, and was quite successful in her field, which was largely male-dominated, and she stood up to all the subversion that threw at her. And she went on to inspire her daughter Eleanor, who also became a prominent social activist.